Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And a huge thank you to Shirley Mann, Ginny Bell, and Katie Hutton for coming and giving their time today and just coming to talk to us about their latest novels and their work to date. A few housekeeping things. Please make sure your microphone's switched off and your camera's switched off as well. We're going to have 15 minutes from each of the authors, and then towards the end of the session, we'll have 15 minutes for any questions. Feel free to submit your questions as we go along as they occur to you and put them in the chat. If you want to say where you've come from in the chat, you can do as well. We are recording the session. I've set up an evaluation form to come out to you all at the end of the session. So if you could fill that in for us and let us know what you thought, that would be great. So first of all, I'll hand over to Ginny Bell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, and hello everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Ginny Bell, and I thought I'd kick off this session by giving you a little bit of information about my Dover Cafe series. I don't know if any of you have read them, but what started out as a series of novels about a family surviving in one of the most dangerous towns in the country during World War II has somehow ended up as a sort of historical EastEnders based in Dover. So for the Queen Vic, read Castle's Cafe. For Albert Square, read Dover's Market Square. And for Peggy Mitchell, read Nellie Castle, matriarch and owner of the Castle's Cafe. And believe me, she's more than happy to chuck people out of her cafe if she doesn't like them. But so far, I've managed to restrain myself from her saying, "Get out of my cafe." But I don't know how much longer I can withstand the temptation, so look out for it in book 3. So Nellie is a widow who, since her husband's suicide in the 20s, has run the cafe and brought up her 6 children single-handedly, which means she's strong, feisty, opinionated, and fiercely protective of her children. Just the sort of person who wouldn't balk at running a cafe right in the line of German shells and bombs in Britain's frontline town. As for her 6 children, 2 of the boys are in the army. They're based up on Dover's Western Heights at Drop Redoubt, conveniently, while her eldest son is an officer in the Navy and works at Dover Castle, also very convenient, but you know, this is fiction and I just love those boys and I want them really close. As for the girls, we have Marianne, single mother of Donny and subject of the Dover Cafe at War. We have Edie, who is a mechanic and has a very fractious relationship with her mother. She lives and works at Pearson's Garage near the castle, and she'll be the star of book 3, The Dover Cafe Under Fire. And finally, there's Lily. She's a nurse and she goes through all sorts of turmoil in book 3, to The Dover Cafe on the Front Line, which was out last week, so you can read it now. But at the center of every book is Nellie, loud, annoying, but determined to do all she can to help her community, whether it's legal or not. And her friend Jasper, her husband's best friend, but since he died, he has acted as a surrogate father to the kids. What is their relationship all it seems? I'm not going to tell you, you'll just have to read the books to find out. But the most important character at the center of every book is the town of Dover itself. Once a beautiful seaside town where people would pop down for a bit of a holiday, World War II transformed it into a battered ghost town. Of the approximately 40,000 inhabitants that lived there pre-war, only around 12,000 remained by the end. And it's taken the town years to rebuild and repopulate. In fact, I would argue that it's never really recovered. And so into this partially resuscitated town, I arrived in 1984 with my parents for an interview to study for my A-levels at Dover College. I'd had several interviews at various schools and I wasn't sure exactly where I wanted to go. But my parents and I walked around the town. It was raining, grey and run down and full of traffic on their way to the ferry. But the castle and the sea sold it to me. And I decided then and there, if they'd have me, I'd go there. And so I did, and I spent my time as most teenagers do at that age, sitting for hours in cafes playing Space Invaders, roaming around town on boring, rainy Sunday afternoons, drinking illicit alcohol and having brief but heartfelt romances. We'd walk up to Western Heights and shelter in one of the many pillboxes that had housed Dover's sea defences, completely oblivious of the significance of where we were, and unaware of the tunnels just beneath us that had sheltered the people of Dover from the constant shell bombardment. We'd lie in Pencester Park in the summer, right on top of the air raid shelter. We'd take our ghetto blasters to the beach and drink and dance with no thought of the mines that had once littered the pebbles. Or we'd sit in the castle grounds and share a bottle of wine while we stared down at the Western Docks, just as my character Edie does in the books. So scroll forward many years and I started thinking about writing a series of novels set in World War II, but I wasn't sure where to put it. Somebody told me to think about the places I knew. So there was London, already done. There was Brighton, possibility. There was the leafy suburbs of Middlesex, which was incredibly boring. And there was Dover. And as soon as I read about a restaurant called Iggleston and Graves on the corner of Market Square, where many servicemen and women used to eat, and realised what the town had gone through, there was no question that this would be where I set my books. During the war, Dover was justifiably known as Hellfire Corner, and what the townspeople lived through is extraordinary. The towns all along the southeast corner of Kent suffered terribly, but Dover, just 24 miles from France, bore the brunt. In all, they had 2,226 shells fall on them, not counting the bombs, and over 10,000 buildings were either destroyed or damaged. There had been over 3,000 alerts and 211 civilians had been killed. This relatively small number, no doubt partly thanks to the caves and tunnels that sheltered them. Then the worst of times arrived after D-Day on the 6th of June 1944, when a relative peace descended on the country. Although there were a few intermittent bombing raids, the residents of Dover were trapped in the tunnels and in air raid shelters as they suffered day and night bombardment until the last shell fell on the 26th of September 1944, coincidentally badly damaging Iggleston and Graves. During those months, there was a shortage of food because no deliveries could be made, and you took your life in your hands when you went out. And yet I'm not sure that this story is widely known. Of course, at the time, there was a lot of reporting from Kent and from Dover in particular. They had visits from Churchill, from the King and the Queen. But the sheer grit and resilience of the population who remained, despite everything, and then were faced with the enormous task of rebuilding their shattered town, is something I don't think many people are aware of. I hope, though, in a small way, I managed to portray it in my novels. But not only that, I hope I managed to convey the spirit, the humour, and the community that must have existed at the time. So I thought I'd read you a short extract, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I've chosen to read a scene from the day the first shells fall. It must have been an utterly terrifying experience because the shells came out of the blue with absolutely no warning. And for the people of Dover, who had already endured weeks of bombing raids, as well as having the Battle of Britain being fought right over their heads, and who surely thought that things couldn't get much worse, this must have been a truly horrendous moment. So we're in the cafe, and I'll start, if that's all right. It was a busy lunchtime in the cafe when an explosion echoed down the hill and in through the open door. Every head went up as the customers looked around in bemusement. There had been no siren and the sky had been uncharacteristically quiet that day. Gladys squeaked in shock as she dumped a plate in front of a group of shoulders and scrambled to the door to join the crowd in the market square, who as one had stopped to stare up into the clear blue sky. Jasper was sitting at his usual table by the kitchen door, tucking into Marianne's tasty rabbit stew and mash, and he rose immediately, rushing through the tables to join Gladys. Nellie stared around the room. "What the hell was that?" she exclaimed, as Donnie thundered down the stairs from the apartment above. "Mum, we've been attacked," he yelled, running into the cafe. Some of the soldiers stood, putting their steel helmets on in readiness. "This is it," one of them said grimly. "The invasion has started." "You can't be serious," Nellie said as her stomach swooped with nerves. Jasper returned. "Everyone get down to the basement now," he shouted as another boom shook the windows. Nellie shoved Donnie into the kitchen. "Get downstairs, lad, and try not to worry." She turned back. "But what is it, Jasper?" Jasper was jamming his helmet onto his head. "I don't know, Nell, but I don't like it. A bomb's dropped near Stargate. Whatever it is, you need to get this lot to safety." He ran to the door, knocking into Gladys, who was coming back in, her face pale with shock. "Don't go, Jasper, it's too dangerous." Nellie's voice was shrill as she grabbed the birdcage, in which Polly was squawking and flapping her wings. Jasper turned and flexed his arm at her. "Don't worry about me, love. It'll take more than the Nazis to bring me down." He winked and ran out. Nellie watched him leave, her heart in her mouth. She was always worried about him during air raids. but at least she understood the dangers. But this could be anything. And if the soldier was right and the invasion had started, then they'd be sitting ducks waiting for the Nazis to come and gun them all down while they cowered in the dark. Come on, Mum, Marianne took her arm. Do as he said, he'll be fine. Nellie swallowed, trying to bring her fear under control as she allowed Marianne to lead her to the basement. She wasn't used to having someone taking charge of her, but just this once she felt paralysed by uncertainty and fear. Fear for the community she loved and for the foolish old man who'd run out into certain danger, as though a strong arm and a tin helmet would be enough to protect him from whatever had just landed on the town. When the all clear sounded, everyone in the basement at Castle's Cafe breathed a sigh of relief. They'd sat for the past hour in tense silence, listening to the muffled crashes and explosions and straining to hear the telltale drone of planes. But there'd been nothing. As they emerged, Nellie made her way out of the back gate and round into the market square. Dust and smoke were swirling in the air, and around her people were venturing out, looking puzzled and shocked. You got any idea what that was? She called over to Phyllis Perkins, who was standing outside the fishmonger, hands on her hips and a bemused expression on her face. Ethel Toner came out of the grocery store, and the three women met in the centre of the square, staring down to the seafront, where a cloud of dust could be seen rising up into the sky. Not a clue, Nell. All I know is that it scared the wits out of me, Phyllis shuddered. 1 minute of serving fish, the next, boom! No planes. She looked up at the empty sky. By this time, several more people had congregated at the square. It started. Gladys was standing in the doorway of the cafe. Saints preserve us, we need to leave now. Oh, stop being so daft, Nellie exclaimed. I don't see Nazi soldiers, do you? They're sly ones, though, Lou Carter growled. They could have been here all along, just waiting for the signal. She pointed towards the sea, glinting blue under the bright sun. Any moment now, they'll be coming up the beach, and I, for one, won't go down without a fight. She marched over to her store, and after fishing around under the counter, she came out brandishing a pistol. Who's joining me? She looked around at the few men in the group, most of whom had fought in the last war. You've still got your pistols. They might need a bit of oiling, but they'll do. Oh, that's great. I feel much better now, Nellie said sarcastically. Lou Carter and a group of old men with guns running around the place sounds more dangerous than Hitler himself walking in to order a piece of pie. No, if it were an invasion, then we'd hear guns going off all around. Jasper puffed up then. Shells, he called. Bloody shells from France, that's what the word is. He removed his helmet and rubbed at his bushy grey blonde hair. One landed down on the front and there's more damage on Western Heights. He shook his head. They keep on like this, the whole town will be rubble before we know it. There could be more at any moment. Quick, back to the shelters. Gladys ran over and grabbed Nellie's arm, trying to pull her back inside. For the love of God, Nellie, stop wailing. Gladys, sorry. If we start panicking now, we'll be dead by tomorrow for sure. She's right though, Nell. It was already bad enough, but if this keeps on, we might all have no choice but to leave, Phyllis said. You can do whatever you please, but I'm going nowhere, Nellie said staunchly. Then she sighed as she looked around her beloved market square, imagining the havoc the shells could wreak on it without warning. How are we supposed to carry on when they just keep finding more stuff to chuck at us? Jasper put his arm around her. Hey, Nell, we'll find a way, right? We can't let those buggers chase us out of our homes. Nellie leant her head against his shoulder and stood up straighter. Come on, everyone, back to work. Like Jasper says, we can't let the buggers beat us. And if anyone needs a bit of help, send them my way. Castles will do what we can to make sure folk don't go hungry. 1 in a million, Nellie Castle. Jasper patted her shoulder fondly. Nellie looked up at him. Yeah, and so's Hitler, she said sardonically. Anyway, let's get back to it before the next bloody siren goes. Anyone fancy a cuppa? So that's the end. Thank you so much for listening to me yakking on about Dover and my books, and I hope that you haven't been bored. And later, if you have any questions, please just ask anything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ginny. That was fantastic. Next up, we have Shirley Mann. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thanks to Northumberland Libraries for asking us. Really pleased. This is just lovely. Although I think it's a bit of a misnomer. So far, we've got Penny from Frome in Somerset and Glenys from Stalybridge in Manchester. So it's lovely to know that people are far and wide. But it's particularly nice to be on a panel with Ginny and Katie, whose books I really enjoy, and I think you will too, if you haven't already read them. So my journey, well, I feel I should dedicate this talk to Chuck. Now, Chuck lives in Arkansas, and he's one of the antique tractor people, and he sort of sums up my journey, because I've been led down some very strange routes, meeting people I never thought I'd meet, talking to people online that I never thought that I would talk to. And it's just been an amazing experience. He taught me everything I needed to know about tractors, and an awful lot that I didn't, strangely. And I can now bore people to death on any subject to do with antique tractors, and also about the undercarriages of hurricanes that I learned from John, who was the engineer at the Shuttleworth collection. And all these people have been so kind in helping me. And I'm just now talking to the Isle of Man, the Manx Nostalgia group on Facebook. And they're telling me everything that I ever needed to know about the Isle of Man during the war, because that's going to be my 4th book. So if we go back 9 years, I was 60, now heading towards 70 at a rate of knots. So this is a very unexpected late career for me. But my mum was in the last 3 years of her life. And for anybody out there who's got an elderly relative, you know that you lose sight of the twinkly-eyed person. I mean, my mum used to dance around the kitchen to Glenn Miller and things like that. And those last few years were quite difficult. But I did think, actually, I need to rediscover her and my dad, who died much earlier in their early life. A sort of, you know, like the film The Notebook. Anybody's seen it? And I thought that, sorry, I'm going to have to get rid of this chat because it's very distracting. Hang on a second. Let me just move that out of the way. From nice as it is to talk to everybody. I thought, well, I'll ask some questions and see if I could possibly transfer, because my background is I'm a journalist. But of course, I've always had facts to help me. And if I got the facts wrong, then I was up on a libel case as a journalist. So I became absolutely ridiculously paranoid about finding things out and making sure that I got the information right. So I asked my mum some questions, but then after she died, of course, I realized I hadn't asked enough. And if I can say anything to all of you out there, if you've got elderly relatives, please do make sure that you ask them questions now before it's too late. But anyway, so I went on a few courses, well, a lot of courses, and many courses I could, because I thought I know nothing about how to do this. But I wanted to rediscover their romance. And fortunately, they did do interesting things during the war. My mum was in Bomber Command with the WAF, so she saw in Lancasters, and my dad was in the 8th Army and travelled up from Africa through Sicily and into Germany. And he had obviously a very different war from my mum. But so when my mum died, I thought, well, I better hurry up here. So I raced around the country talking to elderly service women all around the country. And fortunately at that time, you know, a lot of them were still around. They were in their 80s and 90s, and they were just so impressive. I just loved them to pieces. And they were really kind in sharing their stories with me. So I sort of moved away from my mum's story. And although it's loosely based, Lily's War, which is my first novel, is loosely based on my mum and my dad. It isn't their story. And I just loved everything that these women were able to tell me, because what it did was a little bit like Ginny's just done. It takes you down that street. It takes you down the street at that time in that day. And that to me was so important. I mean, it was just, I found out so many things that just weren't in the history books, a few of which I'll just share with you now. For example, these are things that you probably didn't know and maybe never needed to know, but here you go. Cabbage and Marmite were the favourite sandwiches, and that was because Marmite wasn't rationed. So it's one for you to try with your tea tonight, maybe. They used old pennies for their sinks because water was a very precious commodity, but all the rubber for the plugs had gone to the war effort to make tyres, I think, for aircraft. And so they would use old pennies to put in the sinks to hold the water in. For some reason, Crewe Station always smelt of fish. Now, I don't know why I needed to know that for a line, but I just thought that was amazing and can't go through Crewe without thinking about that. And the Canadians always hogged the iron. Apparently, they were absolutely obsessed with ironing their uniform, and none of the Brits could actually get hold of the irons. So they're useless piece of information that I can delight any dinner party with. So Lily then led to the ATA, which is the Air Transport Auxiliary. Now, I found out about this during the first book, and it was then that I thought, crikey, if I ever do finish this book, and bear in mind it took me 6 years and I kept putting it away, maybe I could write a second, and I do want to write about the ATA. So I thought, well, I'll find out about them as well. But I raced very quickly down to see the last remaining Air Transport Auxiliary female pilot, who is Mary Ellis. And never thought to ask where she lived, but she lived in the Isle of Wight, which is a long way from Derbyshire, but that's absolutely fine. I arrived on her doorstep looking absolutely drenched. I'd gone through a cloudburst, and she opened the door at 101, can I say, with blue slacks and a white shirt, looking absolutely the consummate professional. And I squelched into her conservatory. Bless her, she didn't even turn a hair. It just showed me exactly the sort of person she was. And as I talked to her, she told me an awful lot about what it was like being an ATA pilot, which basically, as far as I could gather, meant that you had to run across a tarmac, clutching your little blue ferry notes to find out what this plane that you were about to fly, that you'd never been in before in your life, and fly it to the other end of the country. And you had to discover what were its foibles. Now, to me, I'm a person who still doesn't know what FN5 does on my computer. So I just thought that was an amazing thing for these women to do. And they had impossible timetables. They traveled up and down the country. They would hitch their way back. They would get trains. They would sleep on stations. They had no niceties and no luxuries, but they had an amazing time. And as I talked to Mary, I asked her whether she drank a lot, bearing in mind I'd talked to the WAFs who did, and whether she swore and whether she went out with men. And by the time she finished, I sort of thought, well, I'm not sure you can be my heroine. You're far too perfect. She just knew exactly how to be the consummate professional. But I started out with this idea that I would link each book if I ever did a third, and bear in mind, I take every step very, very slowly, that I would have a little link between. It wouldn't be a series, but it would be a link. So I have a little bit of each book in each one. So I introduced characters in book 1 that never occurred to me would turn up again in book 3. So I randomly got a pin out with a map, and I picked Sull House in Norfolk for one of Lily's friends, who was a Land Army girl I just happened to mention. Land Army Girl is book 3. And that one's due out on the 14th of October as an ebook, and then in March next year as a paperback. So all of a sudden, I've got myself into a complete hole by having to refer back to things that happened in Lily and move forward to Bobby's War, which is this book, and then move forward again to Hannah's War. So I have to keep a chart on the wall as to where everybody is and what they're all doing. Otherwise, I could get in a complete muddle. But so then Hannah's War took me back to finding out about, I then had to find out about being on a farm. Fortunately, my husband is a 1950s farm boy from Cheshire, so he was useful. So if anything's wrong, blame him, if I've got any facts wrong on that. And then the fourth one is going to be about the Isle of Man. Now, my parents were buried in the Isle of Man, so I've got a huge affection for it. And once I found out that they had something called the Wire on the island, where they put thousands of internees that they didn't know what to do with. So anybody who was in Britain at that time, that they were sort of Jewish Germans, German Nazis, prostitutes, gypsies, conscientious objectors, any Mosley supporters, and all this range of people they put on the Isle of Man. And there was a woman's camp down in the bottom once I found out about Russian camp, I thought, well, I'm going to have to write about that one, aren't I? So that's my fourth book, which sort of brings the whole thing full circle. And it has been an amazing journey. Started off by just a bright spark idea 9 years ago, and I never thought it would take me there. And I have to proudly say that Bobby's War actually won the Romantic Saga Novel of the Year award this year, which I found absolutely incredible. And I'm thrilled to bits with that. And as I say, this is a journey I never thought I'd start, but it's not only my journey. What I want to do is actually preserve the legacy of these amazing women that I've met, because their stories deserve to be remembered. And they were just girls who were in, you know, under their mum's apron strings and attached, and they never thought they would break out the way they did. And I love writing about these women. They come to life for me, as I'm sure both Ginny and Katie's do, and I know they do because I've read their books. But, you know, they become real people, and you suddenly think, what was it like for a 19-year-old to be thrust into these worlds? You know, we've just had COVID, and we've all been absolutely shocked and devastated. But they had 6 years of war. They had 6 years of being bombed. They had 6 years of deprivations. They couldn't get hair shampoo. They couldn't have water to wash in. They certainly didn't have showers, most of them. You know, all these things that we take for granted. And every time, I mean, this is what quite a few of them said to me, if ever you moaned, the Land Army girls, Dorothy and Iris, both said this. They said, if ever you moaned, all you heard was that dreadful phrase, don't you know there's a war on? Nobody was allowed to complain. Nobody was allowed to moan. No matter what happened to you, how many relatives you lost, how many people you didn't hear from. There were no WhatsApps, there were no mobile phones to get in contact with people. You know, I go into a blind panic if my daughters don't ring me for 24 hours, thinking they're dead somewhere. You know, what was it like not to know where people were? And I love getting into that street in Manchester, Norwich, the Isle of Man, anywhere that my books are placed, because I just want to walk down the street with those women, because they have a story to tell, and I just love being part of that story. So I thought I'd read you the beginning of Bobby's War. Bobby is one of my, well, she's not my favorite heroine, actually, because it's like being asked to choose between your children. But I did like Bobby, and I do think she's the sort of person you would want by your side. Can I say she's hopeless at men, but she's absolutely amazing at everything else. The cow's huge black eyes stared impassively from its position at the front propeller of the Tiger Moth aircraft. Roberta, Bobby for short, stuck her tongue out at it, but it carried on chewing. The aircraft was being rocked by the skittish movements of the 20 or so Frisian cows that had raced across the field to examine this enormous bird that had seemingly fallen out of the sky. Ha! Fallen my foot, Bobby told her skeptical audience. It was skillfully landed, despite crosswinds and the fact that this moth's nose is high on landing. She pushed her thighs together and winced. She needed to reach the hedge, and quickly. But she scanned the herd, and they showed no sign of moving. Shoo! She yelled at the crowd around her, but still they didn't react. A farmer's daughter, she had no fear of cows, but she gave them enormous respect. She breathed in sharply and tensed her stomach. She should never have had that last cup of tea. Bobby glanced at her watch. Time was marching on, and she was only in Lancashire. She had to get to Oxford before nightfall. She waved her arms frantically at the crowd of four-legged admirers, and then froze mid-wave as a human face appeared in the middle of the herd. A brown-haired, freckled man in RAF uniform was gently pushing the cows out of the way. Once other uniforms appeared, the cows backed off, sensing defeat. The coast was finally clear, and Bobby was able to unstrap herself and jump down to the ground. Blimey, it's a girl, the freckled young man explained. You're surely not on your own, darling. Bobby gave a very curt nod and said, excuse me one moment, and walked with great haste towards the far edge of the hedge. She crouched down and heard guffaws of laughter from the other side of the field. Roberta Hollis never blushed, but there was a rosy tinge to her cheeks when she emerged from the hedge, rearranging her uniform. Now, gentlemen, I must thank you for your assistance, but could I ask you to move out of the way while I take off? Not so fast, a blonde-haired lad said, standing with his arms folded in front of the wing. We abandoned perfectly good pints in the King's Arms and came to check you were okay. We want an explanation. Have you never seen a female pilot before? Bobby looked in exasperation at her watch. She didn't have time for this. It's the ATA, a Scottish voice said from the back of the group. What's that when it's at home? The freckled one demanded. Air Transport Auxiliary, the Glamour Girls. They deliver planes, the Scot explained patiently. Interesting as this aviation history lesson is, Bobby butted in, I've got a delivery to make and need to get to Oxford by nightfall. Does that mean you fly these things on your own? Yes, now you have to let me leave. Although, as you're here, you can get me started. This ground's rougher than it looked from the air. You can wing walk me over the ruts. Good job we've been specially trained in the war by the RAF, but we'd never known how to do that, one tall man muttered as he moved to hold the wingtip, ready to walk it forward and keep it steady. And you, Bobby added, pointing to another one with dark hair, you can swing the prop. Watch for my thumbs up. Bobby mounted the wing and climbed into the aircraft, hurriedly buckled the 4 straps around her and started the cockpit checks. Okay, she shouted to the dark RAF man at the front. He turned the prop several times and then stepped away, shaking his head. She was concentrating too hard to even notice the stroking of chins and amazed expressions she was leaving behind as she taxied down the field, scattering the cows once again. Tutting to herself, she swore never again to drink more than 1 cup of anything before she set off. That was another lesson she'd learned. On the ground, a crowd of men stood with their mouths agape, watching the wings soar into the air, the tail kept impressively steady, and the small aircraft with a woman at the controls disappear into the October sunshine. So thank you for listening, and hope you enjoy the rest of the talk, which I'm sure you will.
Thank you, Shirley. That was fascinating. And finally, we've got Katie Hutton. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to me this afternoon. I thought what I would start by saying is a little bit about, why I'm a writer and how I came to be one. And libraries have a very strong part in that. I've always haunted libraries. I think it was partly because as a teenager, I was very shy, and it was a lot easier to read books and to disappear into those kinds of worlds sometimes than it was to kind of make more friends in a way, because you were never lonely if you had a book, really. That was my thinking. So, and I suppose I'm an historical novelist because the books that I was reading as a teenager were the classics. They were Thomas Hardy, and they were the Brontes and Austen and so forth, and George Eliot. And those people, of course, weren't writing historical novels. They were writing contemporary novels at their time, but it was something about the world that those people inhabited and the how those people lived that fascinated me. So I knew that I would always kind of go into that world. And this was confirmed because I have a confession to make. I used to be a library assistant, and I had a student job in Edinburgh. So for 4 years, I worked in branch libraries, and I had my friends who were librarians would say things to me they'd say things like, well, we don't read all the books, but we do read an awful lot of dust jackets, and we know what goes out. And I can remember very vividly, even now, one of my jobs was shelving. So I'd have to go behind the desk and get all the books into the right order, into alphabetical order to shelve them. But there were some books which you never had to shelve. And one group was science fiction, one group was Westerns, one group was crime, and the other one was historical romance or historical novels. And so I would set off with my little trolley, and all the readers would appear, they'd leave the shelves where they were, and they would follow me like a kind of, a swarm of locusts to see what was on the trolley. And I would start by putting the historical novels up on their display, because you never had to shelve these books. They just were read all of the time. And I thought, if I get round to writing, that's the kind of, because I couldn't do crime and I couldn't do sci-fi, and I couldn't, be Zane Grey and write Westerns. So I thought, those are the ones that I'm going to write. It took a bit of doing, because I didn't really get going probably until I was into my 40s, and I'll be 60 next Sunday. And I didn't start publishing fiction until 5 years ago. 5 years ago this week, I got a short story in a magazine in Wexford, and I've had 19 short stories, 2 novels, 2 novellas published since then. And I've got 2 more novels coming out next year, one with Zafir, one with another publisher. So when you get the bug eventually, it's you know, it really gets you. In a way, I feel a bit of a fraud, because in February, I'm going to be judging a writing competition. And the section they've given me is the 18 to 25-year-olds. And, you know, I'm going to praise them for what they're doing and say, you know, I wish I'd started earlier as well. So if there's anybody out there who's a writer as well, keep writing. Don't think, well, I'll do it when I retire. I'll do it when the kids are left home. Just start doing something, you know, every day, and stop worrying about how good it is either. So I have that kind of connection with libraries, and I'm so grateful because I'm going to be reading today from this novel. This is my most recent novel, which is set mainly in Nottingham. And I can't thank enough the staff of Nottingham Central Library and the local history section in the library for all the things that they made me think of. You know, that they had a huge photographic library and so forth, and the book set in the 1950s. And in the end, I actually set part of the novel in what used to be the Central Library. It's now part of Nottingham Trent University in Nottingham. And I put a librarian in as a major character. The other people to thank, and listening to Shirley, I was thinking about, you know, the way that you must be accurate in what you're doing. The other people who are invaluable to people like me are local historians. My hero in the book I'll read to you from is from Kimberley, which is a former mining village just outside Nottingham. And there was a plot twist where you had to be able to see Swingate Water Tower, which was built in the early 1950s, from the cemetery, which is on a kind of raised bit of ground in Kimberley. You had to be able to see that because Swingate Water Tower is crucial later on. And I couldn't go to Kimberley. I'd been to Nottingham, but I couldn't go to Kimberley because of COVID. And so the Kimberley Local History Society, I asked them this question. I said, can you actually see the water tower? It looks from the map as if you'll be able to see the water tower. And they said, interestingly, they said, you can't now because they widened the road to eastward in the 1970s, and they built all these trees so that, you know, to kind of absorb some of the sound, you know, to hide the road. But in the 1950s, you could see it. And there were those kind of details that, you know, I just feel it's so important to get right. And the other things that I think are so important to get right are things like how people speak, because how we speak now is so homogeneous in a way. And yet in the 1950s, people moved around a lot less. And in fact, the experts who were people from Mansfield, people from Nottingham, the lady who does the audio version, the audible version of this book is from Nottingham. She put me in touch with all kinds of people and her relatives, and they read it and said, that's right, that's not right, that's too Derbyshire, no, we wouldn't say that, and no, that's too Southern, and all these kind of things. But, you know, even then people were speaking differently from village to village. Now, you can't reproduce that completely. And if you did, you probably sound as if you were kind of almost making fun of people, because some of the accents might be quite extreme. But I think, and you've also got to think, when you put an accent down on the page, how somebody will read it will depend on what their particular filter is. So, you know, I'm very kind of aware of these things. Culturally, this is completely impossible to tell by accent now, but I'm from Belfast. So, and that's another thing that's really influenced me as a writer, because one of the things that I consistently write about in my books, both in the first one, The Gypsy Bride, which is actually the parent, it deals with the love affair of the parents of the girl who's the heroine in this book, is the idea of love and culture clash. You know, that there are certain people you're allowed to be with and certain people that you're not. And in fact, the book that I'll be bringing out next year is going off in another direction. Again, it's going to be set in Cleator Moor in what was Cumberland, near Whitehaven, and in before the First World War. And it's set in the kind of the diaspora of people moving from Ulster to Northwest England to work, and how the sectarian sort of fault lines were actually exported to England. I mean, we think about that a bit with Liverpool and Glasgow, but perhaps less you know, that part of, you know, Cleatamore or Bower-in-Furness, for instance. But it was very strong. And in fact, my great grandparents went to work for a while in England because they were mixed marriage. It was, you know, they were going to have they thought a more straightforward life in England. I mean, they are not the people in the book, but it kind of inspires the people in the book. So that will be Anya Vainsworth Moore next, which is next year's book. So, Gypsy's Daughter, I shall read you a little bit about this. Now, I've dedicated this book to my mother and father, who went to Nottingham University in the 1950s. They were the first people from their family to go to university, to go into any kind of third level education. And that was enabled by legislation, the Butler Act, which enabled people to go to grammar school for free if they passed the 11 plus, and then to go to university on some quite basic scholarships. But it was the first attempt, if you like, at some kind of social mobility post-war, and the whole idea that you could reconstruct post-war. And what I wanted to get across in writing the book also was, you know, as Ginny said, you know, it's a portrait, her book is a portrait of Dover as well, and Nottingham as a character in this book. And it was a place where they were making so many things. You had 9,000 people alone making bicycles in Raleigh. You had Aristoc, you had Boots, of course, which is still there. You know, you had people making lace, industrial lace. I mean, there were cigarettes, you know, players. I mean, it was just a huge factory. And then at the edge of this, you've got a university, which was endowed by Jessie Boot. And in fact, the heroine, Harmony Loveridge, who's the daughter of the people in the first book, stays in Florence Boot Hall. I mean, that was, I think, the first women's hall in Nottingham University. And that was endowed by Jessie Boot's daughter. So there was this link, if you like, between commerce and education, which is perhaps in some respects a bit more separated now. Unfortunately, though I've dedicated the book to my parents, my mother is no longer in a condition to read it. So she's not quite sure who my dad is. We're at that kind of stage. So, but I'm so grateful to them for the stories they told me about what life was like in Nottingham in the 50s, and the story that I'm about to tell you about painting the lions in Slab Square, which is where Harry, the heroine, meets the hero of the book. We've met the hero before early in the book. He's the boy that comes from Kimberley, who has a very different path to where he gets to from hers, and he's not long back from national service as well. Slab Square is Market Square in the middle of Nottingham, but everybody calls it Slab Square. And the council house, which is this, it's not a council, it's a big building, it's the city hall. And there were two lions outside with sort of folded paws, rather hieratic lions. And as I say, the story is based on what actually happened. So Harry's getting involved in this student rag event. Harry still felt as though she walked on springy turf as she pushed open the door of the private bar. The faces inside swiveled towards her. "Oh, there you are, Harry. You look cheerful." "Do I? Thank goodness you could make it. We want your photograph for the front of the rag mag," said the convener. "Something that'll make everybody sit up and take notice." "Why do you want me?" said Harry, pulling up a stool. "Well, you're a lot better looking than any of us," he said. Harry rolled her eyes. "What'll I be doing in this photograph? I'll tell you right now, it won't be a shimmy dance." "Look at this first," said another student, pushing a folded copy of the Nottingham Post across the bar table. "Vandals tip paint over limes in Slab Square," Harry read. She looked up, eyebrows raised. "The idea, Harry, is that you go there with your paints, and when you paint the lions on a piece of paper or a canvas or whatever, then someone, well, one of us obviously, sees you doing it and goes to a call box to ring the plods. They come piling down when they hear that someone is painting the lions, only to find you sitting sweetly at your easel, and we get our photograph. So I get into trouble then. Why would you? They won't know which wag thought it up would be a good idea to ring them up. Thought it would be a good idea to ring them up. Lots of people set up an easel there. I'd be telling lies though." "Well, there is that. I've never painted anything in such a public place. Park's all right. It's for a good cause, the Children's Hospital." "Buy me a drink then." "You drive a hard bargain. Haven't said I'll do it yet, have I? I've got to think about it." Harry struggled to the rear of the bus, her painting bag containing Vanlo's easel weighing on her shoulder and her collapsible stool in her right hand. "Let me help you with all that, me doc," said a middle-aged man, "else you might fall and hurt yourself." All right, I'll not ring the bell till the young lady's safely down, called the conductor. Thank you, said Harry, getting down and turning round to get her things. She noticed the flattened nails and the blue smudges beneath the skin of the man's hand as he passed down the heavy bag. A miner. Smiling up at him, she saw the same marks in his face. He sees daylight only Saturdays and Sundays. That was very kind of you, sir. The miner smiled. The conductor rang the bell and the bus rumbled off. Once off the bus, Harry set off across the square and with a deep breath started setting up the easel 4 feet away from the line she was going to paint. I hope they don't forget that phone call, she thought, because I'm going to feel a right dinnerlo if I have to sit here for very long. She smiled to herself. Dinnerlo. That means idiot, by the way, in Romany. Dinnerlo, one of Dad's words. She went on smiling, remembering that in 3 days' time she would be meeting Dr. Holt again to talk about her future. 20 minutes later, she'd forgotten the phone call. The lion's pharaonic head and frown was taking shape on the page. I'm not bad at this. I should do it more often. Funny bib they've given him instead of a mane, like steps. I like his crossed over paws, though. She frowned in concentration. What about a big red bow round your neck, sitting on a child's bed between Dismal Desmond and a Chad Valley teddy bear with a Cupid doll in your paws? Sorry, Lion, not very dignified. She dipped her paintbrush in the water pot. There was a shuffling behind her, followed by an intense silence. Some people haven't got anything better to do than go. She was aware now of a knot of students on the steps just beyond the line, but knew that she had to keep up the pretense that she didn't know what they were doing there. I hope they've not forgotten their blasted camera. And where have the police got to? She sighed and examined the lion's scowling expression for clues. I expect you'd like to be back home in the veldt, she thought. That is, if they have lions in South Africa. She frowned, realising that she knew rather more about South African politics than about the country's geography or fauna. Not right at that, is it? There've been animals there for a lot longer than there've been Boers. She remembered reading the names on the obelisk of memorial to the South African wars in Forest Recreation Ground, wondering at the time if anybody else ever did. Bloody hell, said a voice behind her. Painting the lines in Slab Square, they said. Vandals, best get down there quick, they said, as if we've got no better to do. Harry turned round on her stool and looked up into the sweating face of a police sergeant. His younger colleague had his hand over his mouth, but she could see his eyes crinkle. Beyond them, a knot of people were gathering, a courting couple, an old lady in what looked like bedroom slippers, and a tousle-haired youth in an open-necked shirt. We're going to do you for wasting police time, young lady. What, for painting a picture? Cried the youth. You mind your own business, you'll be booked too, said the sergeant without turning round. The young man shrugged and smiled at Harry. Bloody student, said the sergeant. The younger policeman made a show of taking out a notebook, but his shoulders were shaking. Go on, lad, book her. The sergeant stomped off in the direction of the police box. The constables turned over a page. First name, miss? Harry. Harriet on Sundays, I suppose. No, Harmony. You could be called Albert and you'd still be gorgeous. Hell, give it a go, man, said the policeman to himself. Oh, you must be a peaceful sort of girl then. Me, not a bit of it. Leave her be, can't you? What harm's she doing? Said someone at Harry's shoulder. She glanced round into the face of the young man in the open-necked shirt. You've already been told to stay out of it, retorted the policeman. Turning back to Harry, he continued in milder tones. Who put you up to it, miss? Put me up to what? I didn't know it was a crime to paint in watercolours. It's a nice day and I felt like a bit of fresh air. If someone chose to report it, that's nothing to do with me. It's them that's wasting police time, not me. The policeman tore the paper from his pad and crumpled it. Can't say I believe you, but you've given me the best laugh I've had in ages. Is that all then? I'm not in trouble? Painting a picture? No, that old bastard is always playing tricks like that, taking the details and leaving a poor sod to stew, thinking you'd be called up before the magistrates when sergeants already used the paper for kindling. Can't say it's what I joined up for. Will you come back to finish the painting, I mean? I might do. Maybe I'll see you again then. Maybe. The policeman opened his mouth to say something more when he was interrupted by a shrill whistle from the direction of the police box. Oh, bogger, I'd best go. Goodbye, Harry. Goodbye. Harry started unpinning her work from the easel. Thought he'd never go, said the young man. Oh, are you still here? I must be. Aren't you going on with the picture then? You're good, you are. No, I've done my bit. I can finish it at home. And look over there, they've got their photograph. Harry waved at a gaggle of students on the steps of the council house. One of them raised a camera aloft. Telling porkies to a policeman, he said. Oh dear, I'd never have known. He did. You were a student then? That's right, second year. Oh, where will I empty this? She said, holding the water pot. That flower bed won't mind. Fancy a cuppa, do you? I ought to get back. I have an essay to write. Don't want to be seen with a townie. Harry stared at him, taking in dark blue eyes, the unruly brown hair left slightly too long on top, but free of brill cream, and thank heavens, with no attempt at a quiff. For that, I think I will have that cup of tea, but only if I can have a buttered scone with it. Cream and jam, madam. Of course. Well, come again tomorrow. I were going to take you to the Cardoma, but I think it'll need to be Griffin's. Ever been there? Never. Me neither. They both laughed. My auntie had a job cleaning in there, he said. They've a place up on the top floor apparently. She and her pal used to take their sandwich boxes and sit at the table pretending to be ladies. And the night watchman put a tea towel over his arm and acted the waiter. All in the middle of the night, nobody to see him. Don't think they let any of the staff in as customers, even if it is their day off and they have the money to pay for their tea. I'm not sure I do want to go there then, just this once, just to see if they stop us and accuse us of pinching things. Go on then. Only tea cakes left, he said. He screwed his face up and came out with a passable Kenneth Williams adenoidal sneer. Shocking, I call it. Tea cakes are fine. You're a good mimic. Do you any acting? Acting, he laughed. Acting up more like. Nope, I've been working rally ever since I left school, apart from when I were in army. Where did you serve then? Got my knees brown in Malaya. Don't suppose I'll ever go anywhere abroad ever again. Don't suppose I'll get further than Mansfield, come to that. What about you? Southerner, ain't you? Don't hold it against me. Kent, I grew up on a farm. My dad's the foreman and my mum teaches in the village school. Infants mainly. Lucky man. My father spent his life down Pit, a village outside Nottingham you'll not have heard of. Mum's a housewife and I'm in lodgings about a mile from here. I go and see them on Sundays. I'm Ned Stones, by the way. Harry Loveridge. Loveridge? This is a gypsy name, by the way. There was a lad of that name in school with me. He weren't there for long. He was smart, but couldn't write his own name hardly. Nor could my dad, not until he went to prison. She watched his reaction. Better that than leave a bloke kicking his heels. I think you might pass the test, she thought. Yes, a clergyman taught him, a prisoner, not a chaplain. He was in for fraud, the vicar, I mean. Ned Stones gave a loud, low whistle and heads at the next table turned, but looked quickly away when Harry glared at them. Am I allowed to ask what your old man had done? Of course you can, as he didn't do it. Horse stealing. A middle-aged waitress appeared at Ned's elbow. Will there be anything else, sir? I'm all right, Harry. That was very nice, thank you, said Harry. Well, it's just that we need the table. We can take a hint, said Ned. Let's go downstairs, Harry, and see if they've finished raking our footprints out of that squishy carpet, shall we? Standing outside Griffin and Spalding, Ned said, can I see you again? Don't see why not. Well, what about same time, same place, Saturday next? Without the easel and the clobber? Might have to share you with PC Plod, of course. Harry frowned. I'm not sure I want to share myself with anybody, thank you. Sorry, I don't mean. It's all right, Ned, she smiled. I had a nice time today, even managed not to get myself arrested. I'll see you on the bus then. And then she goes back to hall. I've nearly done. Sphinx like Harry, said Anna that evening. How did it go? Sorry, how did what? Miles away, painting the lions. What did you think I meant? Oh, that, rather well, I think. She got up to fetch her painting. I've still to finish it. Oh, I say, you've talent. Peter nearly got arrested. My godfathers, who by the Sheriff of Nottingham? Harry laughed and told her story. Anna stopped wiping her tears of laughter and sat up attentively when she described the tea cakes episode. You'll not be telling Max, I'd guess. Harry hesitated. It was just a cup of tea, but I said I'd meet him again next Saturday. Matzltov, exclaimed Anna and got up to kiss Harry's forehead. Thank you. So, I'll hand over to our thank you for taking the time. I tend to go on a bit. It's just a Belfast thing. We talk an awful lot. Even if I've been away there for 45 years, I can still talk for Ireland. So.
Oh, thank you so much, Katie. And well, like you, I don't think you can tell that I went to school in Belfast.
Where were you? Where were you?
At Methody.
So was I. Did you have Mr. Spence as a Latin teacher?
Oh, I remember the name. That does ring a bell.
Terrified of him.
There you are. It's a very small world, isn't it?
It is so, yeah.
Absolutely. So it's just been so fascinating to listen to the three of you this afternoon. Thank you so much for all your insights. We have got a couple of questions, and the first one is for you, Katie, and that's from Aidan Morrissey. And Aidan asks a question for Katie. Your gypsy books deal with several characters from the Romany community. How were you able to ensure accuracy as to their way of life and culture?
That's a very good question, because, of course, a lot of that is written about Romany people historically has not been written by Romany people. And I had a bit of digging about to do, but the breakthrough was actually visiting a family in Kent near Sevenoaks, the Brazils. And I got in touch with them via the local history society, and I went down to see them, and they were so helpful, because, you know, I was staggering about reading things like George Borrow, you know, which is ancient. And I mean, George Borrow did obviously live with gypsies and so forth. So, and compiled a gypsy lexicon and things like that. But, and I had all kinds of questions, and some that they were just looked and said, no, well, why would we do something like that? You know, and no, and they were extremely helpful, and they were interested that people were interested in them. But they also said to me, they said, we can't really read your book for you because we don't really read. I think the younger members have been to school, but the people who are about my age, that have been a bit spotty, let's say. And they said, go and ask Tom. And they named an academic. There was a professor of Romany studies at Greenwich University, Thomas Acton. And I got hold of Thomas Acton and asked him if because I do this with all my books, I get somebody specialist to read them. You know, somebody to do a history read, a fact check. And so I got in touch with him and said, have you got a research student who would, and he said, no, I'll do it myself. And he was so helpful. And there were a lot of, because there was also this phenomenon of people at different stages pretending to be gypsies. I mean, if you go and look at Pathy newsreels from the 30s, there's a chap called, Petulengua is his surname, but it's assumed, I mean, he was just a mountebank, but he filmed these things of gypsy weddings in the Yorkshire Dales, and it's all a put up job, you know, and all this hand cutting and things. There were things there that you know, that Tom said, well, people just don't do that. So, but the nicest feedback I had for the Gypsy Bride, there's a lot more Romany input in that, was somebody on the Memory Lane Facebook page who was bowled over by this, and we were kind of corresponding a bit, and she said, I'm from a Romany background and you got everything absolutely right.
Oh, that was a real accolade, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. That's the best thing. I mean, tears came to my eyes with that. I was so pleased.
That's excellent. Oh, thank you so much, Katie. So much, you know, fascinating topics for discussion there. We've got a question from Penny Alexander that she'd like to ask everyone, and it's, do you use a timeline, and if so, what design do you find most useful, and is it best to construct your own timeline? So maybe Ginny, would you like to start with your thoughts on the timeline?
Absolutely, the curse of every author and editor, to be honest. So no, I don't construct a timeline. I actually, because I am writing at specific time between specific dates during the war, and there are events to fit in, I tend to write the story around those, and then I try and sort it into the right timing, because I can't actually, I have no visual sense whatsoever. So I can't look at a diagram, I can't make a chart. None of that makes any sense to me unless it's a linear list of things. So no, I don't even know how you construct a timeline. I just write the book and then I sort of force it into some sort of order.
That's great. Shirley, do you use a timeline?
Well, I got in a complete muddle with my first book, and it did take me 6 years to write, because I had Lily's War, and then the love interest, which is Danny's War, which is a totally different thing, and the World War. And it was my first novel, and I did get in a complete muddle. And to be honest, this book would never have seen the light of day if I hadn't had a bunion operation, because I was bored to tears, and I had 6 weeks where I had nowhere to go and nothing to do, and I got it back out of theoretically from the drawer, but it was on my computer. And I thought, well, if I never sort it now, I never will do. So I did use an Excel sheet, and I put down Lily's war, Danny's war, and the war. And then I matched them up because they were all at different phrases. And because a lot of it is done by, the relationship between Danny and Lily is done by letters, I had to allow for time lapses and things for things to get there. So I had got in a complete muddle, but it was actually, I am ever so grateful to my feet for giving me that time, because I don't think it would have ever seen the light of day. I got in quite a muddle with myself. But I'm better now. I mean, I've sort of, by the time you get to the second and certainly the third, you are better at it. But I do go through and check, and I put things in the side of my manuscript to go back and check later and just make sure that, you know, where would I be without an editor and a publisher? Goodness knows, because it wouldn't make sense. And they pick up all these things. And, you know, like Katie, I get people to read it to make sure that it does make sense and that I am on the right timeline. But timelines are a difficult one, I will accept.
Thank you, Shirley. Katie, do you use a timeline?
I kind of later on use a timeline because I actually don't write chronologically. I write in scenes and then I kind of string them all together. So usually I've written the end of the book long before I've written the stuff in the middle, because it was just advice I got a long time ago, and it seems to work for me that, you know, just to know what you're writing towards it, if you like, you know. So and then some of the clues kind of come in the background to that. I mean, what I did with The Gypsy's Daughter at one stage, because it's the story that, well, two things count, that you need to get the setting right. So, you know, I would read an awful lot of books like this one, for instance, David Kinnear's, you know, his 3 volumes on the 1950s. So, but more to get the feel of the time. And then as the book starts to kind of take place, I do something that's very simple, and I'll just print off off Wikipedia the main events in the 1950s, so that you can reference things like Suez. You can reference things like the Wolfenden Report and stuff like that, because that, you know, both of those come into that book in some shape or form. And it's just to kind of give that. But I do work. I kind of impose a timeline, gets in there later on to tidy the thing up. But I don't let anybody see what I've done until I've sorted it, shuffled it around and sorted it into the right running order. No.
Thank you. Jerry just says how much, you know, how much he appreciated your narration about the University of Nottingham, where he studied, and it brought back so many vivid memories for him. Or her, in fact. Sorry, Jerry, I'm not sure. And a question for Ginny from Maddie Kempner. Ginny, how many of the events are based on real events that happened in Dover?
All of it, actually.
Yeah.
I've found that as I've read so much about Dover, I have realized that I have to downplay what goes on, otherwise people get bored of the shells and the bombs and everyone going up and down to the shelters. But every event that happens within the books, so for example, the Grand Hotel is destroyed in Dover Cafe on the front line, that's not a spoiler. All the barrage balloons are shot down, and the various events that happen, sometimes I change where it happens slightly, but everything is based exactly as, and I try and keep it as much as possible within what happened in those few months in Dover. And I have an amazing book which actually tells me pretty much what happened every single day during the war in Dover. So I've got a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff. So I have events coming up in the next book that are truly horrendous, but couldn't fit into the Dover Cafe on front line. So I've moved them through following a year because it's so dramatic and I couldn't leave it out. But yeah, everything.
Gosh, there's absolute treasure troves of information. Yes. I think it's you know, it's just endless. I think they're endlessly fascinating and so much inspired by all your family histories and the experiences of your parents and where you've all lived. I find that's a theme that's coming through very strongly from all of you. I've got a question from Glenys for everyone. Do you all enjoy reading sagas in your spare time, or do you like to go off track completely? Glenys says she's now reading Dr. Richard Shepherd's, who are forensic pathologists, Unnatural Causes for her book club read, which is really off track. So I wonder, you know, how much variety you seek out in your reading material. Shirley, would you like to start with that?
Yes, I have a dreadful admission to make, that I didn't actually know what a saga was when my publisher said they were going to put me in a saga category. And it was only then that I realized I had read some, but I hadn't realized it was a genre of its own type. I mean, I did English at university. I've been a journalist all my life, so I've read widely, and an awful lot of things that have gone in one ear and out the other, and ones that have stayed with me and formed my life. So my reading habits are very eclectic, and but every now and again you just need a book that's got a beginning, middle and end and takes you there. I really wanted to write something that would take people there and create a world, but that world had to be accurate, which goes back to our last questions. You know, I had to make sure that everything was correct, or else it, you know, as Katie and Ginny know, they just don't work, and somebody, usually called history geek, will pick you up on it. So you have to be very careful. No, it's an interesting experience writing sort of outside your comfort zone, if you like. But if you want to, you know, if you want to write, I'd just say to anybody out there, just have a go in any genre and just see what you think, because until you read an eclectic group of things, you won't know which one suits for you. And certainly I do enjoy writing this sort of book because it evokes history so well. Well, hopefully it does, who knows. But yeah.
Thank you, Shirley. Katie, what do you read in your spare time?
I mean, I read all kinds of stuff. I mean, I read predominantly historical novels, not necessarily sagas. And, you know, like Shirley, I hadn't thought that I was writing one, but it does fit. It does fit completely, also because the kind of people that I think we're all writing about are perfectly normal people. They're not the people that made the decisions. They were the people that the decisions were made on behalf of, and things happen too. And, you know, the risk is if you don't write about, and people can be quite sniffy about sagas, you know, they can call them shawls and clogs and this kind of thing. And yet, you know, what's wrong with writing about the people that history don't write about? You know, because they were the main players as well, because, you know, so I think that's important. I mean, somebody I admire, I've not read her for quite a while now, but thinking back to when I, you know, worked in libraries as well, was, and of course we're hosted in the Northeast, was Catherine Cookson. And I think, you know, her books are kind of set the standard in a way. And what we forget was how big she was. I mean, when I worked in libraries, in the top 10 bestsellers, there would be 4 or 5 of her titles every week. You know, she was just so big. So she is the kind of person who is, as I say, has kind of set that standard. But what I read, I mean, at the moment I'm reading Joseph O'Connor, because I'm going to meet him in Dublin in about 10 days time. So I need to read a bit more, you know, of him and things like that. I review for the historical novel reviews. So I just read all kinds of things. I'll tend to read things where I...
Oh, sorry. Oh dear. Apologies for that interruption.
Yeah, and yeah, so I'll read anything historical, anything about Central Europe, the Habsburg Empire's kind of interest, anything about Ireland. I tend not to read about things that are about American history because I just don't feel I know enough about it. Because if you're reviewing, you need to comment on how historically accurate things are as well. But I mean, if you looked at what was beside, and I also read about 4 or 5 books at once. So
that's great. I think we and Ginny, have you got any comments about your reading interests?
Well, I read very widely also, but I have to say I go through phases, and I have read a lot of sagas, but I have to admit that since I started writing them, I don't read them as much. I think mostly I need a change, and I I need something else, and I'm going through a crime phase at the moment. And what I like about crime as well, is the plotting, because I find the plotting is really hard.
Yeah.
And so when I read crime, where you have to plot quite intricately, it will remind me that it's possible and that I should just get on with it and give me some ideas as well. But I mean, I've been very lucky because I have worked with Katie Flynn many years ago, who's written many sagas, and I suppose I learned from her really. So I have read many, but also what worries me if I read saga now, that I will start unconsciously reproducing what happens in those books in my own book. So I try not to have a look.
Oh, that's an interesting one, Ginny. Well, I think we can finish with this lovely comment from Angela. She says, fascinating input, really makes me want to read your books. And although I'm not really a saga reader, I think you ladies could convert me.
Thank you. Please read.
So, well, we've had an absolutely fascinating afternoon. It's been really very much enjoyed it, and just got me thinking. I mean, I have been very interested in family history myself in recent years and uncovered all sorts of stuff. I'm interested how, yes, you've, rather than writing non-fiction about your family history or writing, you have chosen to fictionalize, and I think that's a very interesting thing. And I don't know if you do feel that, this interest in family history and in catching your parents before it's too late. My parents are in their 90s, and I keep thinking, yes, I must ask this or that, and before it is too late. And so I don't know if you do feel it's something you've come to in later life, but this interest in this more recent past, well, not so recent now, but within when we were children, that was in living memory. So, but Michelle will come on now to remind me of the various housekeeping items. But a really absolutely huge thank you to all three of you for such an enjoyable afternoon. I know we could talk for another hour very easily. Michelle, have we got any final remarks?
Yeah, just to say a huge thank you to Ginny, Shirley and Katie for giving the time today and for such a fantastic session. Yes, as I said at the beginning, there should be an evaluation form coming out to you electronically any minute now, so if you could fill that in, that would be great. And just to say, we've got a whole range of events planned for Libraries Week next week. We've got Glenda Young on Tuesday talking about the miners' last. We've got Denzel Merrick talking about terms of restitution on Wednesday, and Freya Sampson talking about our book, The Last Library, on Friday. So hope to see you all again soon. And thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, absolutely.
And thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
thank you very much.